Well, hello there. Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools, and on today's episode, if you want to learn how we built and installed this beautiful barn door, keep on watching. Let's get started. So, it all starts out with a good base, and this is going to be our 3/4 inch plywood base that we're going to be using for the basis of our door. We're going to cut this down to size, and then we're going to put on our trim after that so we can make a very cool, modern chevron style shape. Let's do it. Your door is obviously dependent on how big your opening is, but a general rule of thumb, for me at least, is to provide a 2-inch overlap on both sides as well as the top of the opening. Which, since I have a 30-inch wide opening, I am making a 34-inch wide door. Now you can obviously cut down plywood in a number of different ways, but one of the easiest ways to do it is just take a straight piece of trim, use a couple clamps, and then take your skill saw and remove all of the excess. Very straightforward and very easy. As for trim that we're using for this project, I decided to go with a 1x4 MDF trim for molding. Now I could have gone with more of a solid wood, but this will guarantee that all of my boards are primed as well as perfectly straight, which is very nice for this application especially. I first found the center point of the actual plywood and then proceeded to cutting the boards at a specific length based upon that. Now the cutting itself is actually very straightforward because all of these boards are at a 45-degree angle, and as long as you have both sides at a 45-degree angle, you'll have a perfect 90-degree for each section. And to make this process even easier, we don't even need to measure these boards out to a perfect length because all of the excess on the ends of these boards is going to be cut off after we have them secured to the plywood. At this point, I could continue the same exact pattern throughout the entire door, but I wanted to spice it up a bit more and make it a little bit more modern, so the remaining boards were cut at a 90-degree angle on one side and a 45-degree angle on the other. That way, I was able to butt all of the ends up flush against the first section that I installed. Whew. Now that is quite a few pieces I had to cut for this panel, but in all honesty, it was quite easy to fully assemble all this, and nothing has to be precise because we're going to be cutting off all the excess in the end. At this point, we now have to fully install these boards, which I'm going to be using some Titebond 2 and a finish nailer. We're going to glue these boards up first, then use the finish nailer to finish it off so these boards don't slide or move on us at all. Let's get to it. When you're talking about this much surface area that you have to apply glue to, I always suggest using your standard foam paint roller. It makes it super easy, as well as you can just throw and toss the foam roller away, which makes for easy cleanup. As you're applying this first section, just be mindful of the fact that this is your most important section because everything that precedes it is going to be affected by this angle. So just make sure you have it at that perfect 45-degree angle that you want, and you can use some type of contractor square just to ensure that you have it at that exact angle. Now the nailing is obviously our second fastening method for each one of these boards, and I would highly suggest doing this because it just adds an extra layer of support and rigidity to this door. As for spacing these boards apart and making sure that they're consistent, I use these U-shaped shims that are actually for tile work. They work out perfectly in a multitude of different avenues and areas. They're super easy to work with, and obviously, as you can see, you can easily combine multiple at a time to change up the spacing based upon what you prefer. And as a quick side note, make sure your nails are not too long because the last thing you want to do is have this thing fully installed and then you realize, oh yeah, the nails are going through the back side of the board. Not good. The trim boards themselves are actually only 3/4 inch thick, and therefore I'm just using 1-inch long nails. And like always, if you do like any of the products or tools seen in this video, I will make sure and leave links in the description box below on where to actually find those products. So, after we have this door fully dried out, it's now time to cut off all this excess. And I figured it'd be easier to do it this way than trying to cut the exact measurement every single time and then going from there. So all I'm gonna do is take a circular saw, a straight edge, cut off the excess, done deal. let's try it out. As for cutting all this excess MDF, it's quite easy. Just make sure you're accounting for the fact that you're not trying to cut any of the plywood down unless you already accounted for that earlier. I have the plywood exactly where I want it, so if I do cut off any of the plywood, it's extremely minimal at this point. And plus, let's be honest, it's a barn door, and luckily it doesn't have to be a perfect size. Yeah, don't tell anyone. It's not like you're trying to get it into a very precise door casing area. This is going to be going onto your wall, not in a wall. Now, I'm sure this is your first barn door video that you've actually come across, but if it's not, note that some of them just apply a piece of trim on all of the edges, and therefore that's how it encapsulates the plywood and the MDF together and you don't see that side. However, me being me, I want to actually step it up a bit and make it more of a unique and beautiful pattern, which is why I'm using Bondo to actually encapsulate the side of the door. Then we're going to sand it down smooth, and that way the side of the door will actually be one cohesive transitional piece, or at least that's what it's going to look like to the naked eye once it's sanded and painted. Naked eye, where did that term come from? Is that really the best we can do? I guess it kind of goes, but if you do know the origin of naked eye, just, let me know in the comments below. Anyways, back to the project. I fill all the nail holes as well as all the seams and let it dry. Luckily with this stuff, it dries within a few moments and you are able to sand it probably within the first 15 minutes of applying it. Just make sure you have the doors and or windows open when you're working with this stuff because it is an extremely strong aroma and you do not want this strong aroma seeping into your house. Trust me. As for sanding, I'm just using my random orbital sander with 200 grit sandpaper to remove all of the excess Bondo. The really nice thing about Bondo is that it's extremely smooth when it's sanded, as well as the fact that it doesn't shrink on you, so your boards will be extremely smooth without any blemishes if done correctly. The edges of this board do need to be softened up a bit, so the best way to do it, in my personal opinion, is taking a round over bit and rounding over all of the edges on the entire door. Very nice, very easy, and as you can see, very smooth. However, I do go over it with a sanding block just to ensure a perfectly smooth finish. Now, because this is a barn door, there's generally going to be some type of floor mounted unit that keeps the door in place, or in more simplistic terms, keeps the door straight when you open and close it so it doesn't wobble back and forth. For this, I'm just using my router with a straight bit, but the one thing to keep in mind is, yeah, as you saw right there, make sure you don't leave those nails too close to the edge at the bottom because otherwise you're going to snip them off and your router will not thank you for it. Now that the channel is cut and before I decide to spray the door, I decide to apply a bit of primer to the bottom edge as well as some of the finish paint. That way it's taken care of and I don't have to go back and try and paint it afterwards. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be pretty because no one's going to see it, but it should be sealed properly. To make sure we have as smooth of a finish as possible, I decide I want to spray this door versus just hand painting it and rolling it. And therefore I install a hook at the very top of the door, which just allows me to prop up the door in a vertical position because all I have to do is hook it up to a bungee cord that I have in the ceiling. And guess what? It's sturdy as a rock and it's not going to go anywhere as I'm spraying it. So our door stood up, ready to go, taped off. Now let's start priming and then paint. For this project we are using the Extreme Bond Primer from Sherwin-Williams, which is a great primer for high-end finish work. Now I do apply 5 to 10% of water to the mix just to thin out the paint in order for the paint to flow out a bit more smoothly out of the paint sprayer. And as for the paint sprayer, we are using the Wagner Flexio 3000.
I've used this sprayer on the last couple projects of mine, and the nice thing about this spray gun is that it comes with a fine spray nozzle as well as a heavy duty spray nozzle. Now we do use both nozzles on this project specifically because I want a nice thick coat of black on this door, and therefore I use the heavier duty version. This finer spray nozzle really only applies to smaller projects, and in all honesty I was pushing it even on this door. In retrospect, I'm just glad that I taped these plastic sheets down because they are a rockin'. After we allow the primer coat to fully dry, I then proceed to our finish coat. And for our finish coat, we are using the Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel with satin finish by Sherwin-Williams. Now this paint is really nice because of the fact that it lays down like an oil, but it's a urethane so you can actually use it with water. Cleanup's easy, as well as add a bit of water to the mix if you want to thin out the paint as well. As I noted earlier, this is the heavier duty spray nozzle for this paint sprayer, and as you can see, it applies a very nice generous amount of paint on your finished product, but it's not too heavy. It's a nice consistent amount of paint, and there was very few drips that I had to account for with the paint sprayer itself. As you're applying paint to this door, just keep in mind that you want to actually start spraying before you even on the door, because you want a consistent pass across the door with off spray on both sides. That will allow you with a nice smooth even finish, and you'll reduce the tendencies of having drips on the sides because you applied a bit more paint on those sides because you're stopping there even for a second or two longer than the majority of the door. Hopefully that makes sense, and if it doesn't, please let me know in the description below because it is a very vital and important part when you're trying to strive for a perfect finish. We always chase that perfect finish, right? Okay, first coat of paint on, and it's looking really, really nice. Finish looking good. Only problem is that those grooves still have a lot of white in them, as you can see. I really thought that that spray would get into those grooves a little bit better, but because it's such a tight groove, it's having a lot of difficulties. So I think I'm gonna try and actually just apply a bit of paint via a paint brush into those crevices, get them that way for sure. That way I know they're fully covered, and then spray the entire thing. So wish me luck. Yes, I know what you're asking yourself, Brent, why didn't you just paint the sides of the trim first before installing the trim on the door? Yeah, I know, it would have been a good idea, but in all honesty, we didn't even have the paint color chosen at that point, and therefore I did not do so. So, you live and you learn, and guess what? It worked out quite perfectly with just a foam brush, applying a bit of paint into those grooves, and guess what? Perfectly jet black, just like everything else. But just make sure once you do apply paint into those grooves, proceed to applying your second and potentially even third coat after that. But guess what? Once we're done with that, let it dry and let's proceed to getting this thing installed. This, of course, is our doorway, which is perfect for a barn door, and we just wanted to hide the fact that we have a laundry room right next to the front door, and we are going to be installing this door hardware from Everbuilt. Now this is a very nice but generic hardware set for a barn door, but I think our barn door is flashy enough. So it comes with the track itself. We also have the two hangers that we're going to be installing onto the door, the bolts and nuts for the door, as well as the lag screws. We have the door stops that are going to be installed on the track itself. We have standoffs. We have more bolts and nuts depending on the door thickness, as well as the floor guide that we'll be installing on the floor. When installing hardware on a finished surface, I always suggest applying a bit of painter's tape on the surface first, and then proceeding to making your marks and drilling and or cutting after that. Just makes life a little bit easier and you're less likely to mar or damage the surface, which is the last thing we want at this point. I have the edge of the hardware offset approximately 4 inches away from the side of the door, and then mark my holes in place. I take a 7/16 inch drill bit and drill out my holes, and then install my hanger hardware with a couple crescent wrenches. Now the one thing to keep in mind at this point is to leave enough space for the track itself. Now specifically, the track is approximately 1.5 inches tall, and therefore you need at least 2 inches of space between the bottom of the hanger to the top of the door. That way you're easily able to take on or take off the door as needed. Go ahead and tighten down your hardware, just make sure your brackets are perfectly straight, and once both hangers are installed and aligned properly, you can proceed to the track. The easiest way for me to determine exactly where the track needed to go was to take a measurement from the very bottom of the door to the very bottom of the wheel on the hangers. I add 1 inch to that measurement, and that will just account for the height that I need to free up space for the floor guide that I'll be installing after this. I was very lucky on this project because there seemingly was a wood header all the way across this doorway, and therefore I was able to hit solid wood throughout this entire span. If you want to install one of these and you aren't this lucky, I would suggest installing a ledger board directly to the wall, paint it black or paint it the wall color, then install your track onto the ledger board. Easy enough. I place a couple pieces of tape down just to indicate exactly where my floor guide needs to be. Once I determine that, then I can install it with a couple screws, remove the tape, and guess what? We're ready to install this door. I lift the door onto the track and then make sure that the guide itself is positioned correctly onto the bottom rail of the door. If it is, it's going to slide smoothly, and guess what? We are done! I absolutely love how this project turned out. The pattern is gorgeous and the richness of the black is really enticing to the whole entry space of the home. And as you can see, the Bondo itself really adds another layer of dimension on that edge because it has such a seamless look and feel to it, and one that I'm truly proud to say is one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.